Hi, welcome to this final session of the McGraw-Hill Education Learning Conference. I'm Mary Isley, one of the Directors of Product Management with McGraw-Hill Education, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping items. Please remember this event is being presented in listen-only mode, which means you will only be able to hear the presenter, but they won't be able to hear you. However, that doesn't mean that you can't participate. You are certainly welcome to type in your questions in the Q&A panel throughout the question, and we will pull those together and answer several of those at the end of the session. Joining us today is Dr. Nancy Marchand-Martella. Nancy's session is titled Effective Strategies and Programs for Adolescent Learners, and she'll highlight the research-based strategies and programs shown to be effective for our students in grades 6 through 12. She's going to focus on reading for understanding and college and career readiness skills. Dr. Marchand-Martella has more than 28 years of experience working with at-risk populations. She is a professor of special education at Eastern Washington University, teaching classes in instructional methodology. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Marchand-Martella.
Great, thanks Mary for the introduction. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate everyone being here today. Good afternoon. Hopefully the weather's nice where you are. I'm looking out the window at some snow in Spokane, Washington, so hopefully it's warmer where you are. So we'll go ahead and get started. We're going to be talking about strategies and programs for adolescent learners. What I'd like to do is share some data from the International Literacy Association. They do a survey every year on what's hot and what's not, and I look forward to that every fall. If you haven't seen that, I'd highly recommend it. But what they do is they compile what are considered very hot topics, and that means those where at least 75% of the survey respondents agree. And here is the list, and if you see the blue asterisk, that means that it was considered very hot in 2015. And if you see the kind of a gold-colored asterisk, that was considered hot, which means that 50% of the respondents considered it to be important. So we've got close reading, deep reading. We have college and career readiness is considered another very hot topic. We have the Common Core State Standards, anything related to digital literacy, anything related to content area or disciplinary literacy, high stakes assessment, anything related to assessment for the Common Core. Informational and nonfiction text is considered very hot, and then text complexity. And we're going to spend more time talking about that as we go through this presentation. The other aspect of the what's hot, what's not literacy survey would be what the respondents indicated should be hot for 2016. And one area, and I'm guessing that's why you're here today, is adolescent literacy. So that should be hot. And number two, anything having to do with writing, whether it's academic, argumentative, or based on information from sources. So again, I'd check that literacy survey out. It always comes out in about September. To make sure we're all on the same page, the definition of an adolescent learner typically is looked at grades 4 to 12. You'll see some of the research is zooming in on grades 6 to 12. But for purposes of this, we're going to look at grades 4 to 12. The other thing I want us to all think about is response to intervention, and that has to do with, of course, tiers 1, tier 2, tier 3, and we'll also be looking at tier 4. But for purposes of this presentation, we're going to be zooming in on tiers 2, 3, and 4. All right. Okay, so back to this. Thanks for your patience. RTI in middle school is going to be the focus of what we're talking about, but again, we can use these aspects into high school. So Mary will advance. Rethinking RTI in middle school. Number 1 would be that we have groups of 2 to 5 students would be what I would recommend, and that's what's recommended in the research rather than using large groups. Most of the time when you think about middle school, there are large groups of students, 10 to 15 students in a group. So we have to rethink that and make much smaller groups for middle school and high school. Number 2 would be secondary prevention. Might be only appropriate for a subset of students. So if we've got students who are low performers, we may want to think about skipping tier 2 and moving into much more intensive efforts. And then the third aspect of rethinking RTI has to do with focusing in on a model that motivates adolescents. Okay. Next, we're going to be, and this is slide 9, talking about 3 key shifts in English language arts for the Common Core. The first one is having regular practice with complex texts and their academic language. Number 2, having to do with text evidence, both in reading, writing, and speaking. And then number 3 has to do with building background knowledge through content-rich nonfiction. So if you're a Common Core state/district, then these would be important for you. Now we're moving on to slide 10 with regard to what types of text should students have available for them, and that would be novels with challenging vocabulary, lots of work in the area of science and social studies textbooks, and then historical papers and texts. Now on slide 11 is a very important point that I just wanted to have you all zoom in on, and that has to do with a readability gap. We're tending to water down the text that high school students see, and we water it down so much that the difference between what they see as a senior in high school and what they see just 3 months later in college is such a large gap that students simply aren't prepared for college level material. So this is about a 2 standard deviation difference. It really speaks to the notion that we need to ramp up our efforts when it comes to the kinds of text that students will see. On the next one, you're going to see, and this is, I think, worth its weight in gold, because you can see there are on the left different types of text that individuals would get based on high school, the SAT, and the military, all the way up through the GRE. But on the bottom, you have to see the Lexile text measures, and high school is at the very bottom. And the important one to look at would be the black bar to the far right. That's the 95th percentile of how hard text is in high school. And if you follow that black line again on the right side all the way up, you are going to see that the 95th percentile for high school text is lower than all the other areas, meaning that we're not preparing students for the SAT, ACT, for the military, for citizenship, reading job applications, in the newspaper. If you follow it all the way up, we are far lower in the type of complex text that kids see. This next slide, you're going to see a person leaping from high school to college. We don't want that, of course. We'd like those buildings to be very close together so that the student walks from high school over to college as compared to trying to make this big leap. And again, that has to do with how complex text is. On the next slide, you're going to see this common instructional thread, and that's going to be the focus on the type of instruction that we should be using when we're working with adolescents who struggle in reading. So the most effective and efficient way to promote engagement and academic success is through systematic and explicit instruction. And I'm just going to spend a few moments talking about what that means. So on slide 15, you'll see the 3 do-its. And that's I do it, we do it, and you do it. And let me just again spend just a few minutes on this. I do it means that we're going to provide very careful modeling that as a teacher, we're showing students how to perform a skill or strategy. The we do it is where the students are actively involved with the teacher. You could see that in also be called like a lead or guided practice. And then the you do it is when students are required to do it on their own. So you might view that as a test. So it could be called model lead test. I do it, we do it, you do it. This is considered to be explicit instruction, and it's really the best way that we should instruct students who are struggling in the area of reading. The next slide really lays out, I'm not going to spend and go through every single aspect, so we'll provide the 3 clicks to put up the information. But if you do have a high percentage of English language learners, The research is very, very clear that if students are English language learners and they struggle with reading, whether it's reading in their primary language or in their second language in terms of English, the best way of providing instruction is through direct and explicit instruction. Again, I do, we do, you do, or model lead test. The model that we recommend, again, is called, that lays out I do, we do, you do, is the gradual release model. And that, again, involves lots of very careful and intentional instruction that fades to the student doing it on his or her own. It includes mastery checks and then review. Now, on slide 18, we know that instruction matters. And in order to improve academic performance, we know that we need three things. We need solid instructional programs. We need well-trained instructors, and we know that we need effective instructional delivery. And so as I go through this, I will showcase some programs that I believe are very, very good to teach some of the skills and strategies. But you need to know, of course, that a program is only as good as the teacher who's using it. So a teacher really needs solid training. And then there's just good, effective instructional strategies like error corrections and praise statements and having students chorally respond. And those, of course, should be a part of that instruction as well. Now, the rest of this presentation is really going to be hinged around the 5 elements of effective reading instruction. Again, remember that we're focusing on grades 4 to 12. And this is based on major research reviews and documents that have been published over the years, and that I would highly recommend you reading if you want to know more about adolescent literacy. But the 5 areas are word study, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension, and motivation. Okay, those are the big 5. And what I'm going to do is now go through and go through each one and then showcase examples from published works. So actually, just to kind of give us a little background, just to make a point, because some people kind of go down the road on word study. Let me just put up this slide 20. This is a quick research review, and just to make the point that if you want to make a difference in the lives of your adolescent readers, that you get the biggest bang for your buck when you focus on comprehension. And we know, of course, word study is important, but if you only focus on getting kids to read fast, that's not going to necessarily produce big gains in vocabulary and comp. And so the research really says that not only should you work on word reading accuracy and fluency, but you should also work on vocabulary and comprehension. Okay, so I just want to make that point before we go diving into these elements. Okay, so on slide 21, you should see us taking a closer look and an examination of the big 5. So element number 1 is word study, and that's on anything having to do with reading at the word level. If you're a Common Core focused state/district, then these are considered foundational skills, and that would be knowing and applying grade level phonics and word analysis skills and decoding words. The next slide, on slide 23, should give you an example of a program that you would use with adolescents. If your students were very low in the area of decoding, you're going to have to use a phonics-based program. This is an example of a great one that I would recommend called corrective reading, where students learn their sounds, there's phonemic awareness, there's blending, they learn to read connected text. There's comp in the program, but the main focus is on decoding. The program ramps up over time so that not only would you be using individual sounds, but you'd focus on sound combinations and reading words the fast way. And then those words are put into stories that the students would read and get feedback based on their decoding. There's also fluency that's built up in that program as well. On slide 25, you'll see an example from a program called Flex Literacy. And not only can you use a print-based program, but you can also use a computer-based program that focuses on sounds, blending, and reading words the fast way. One aspect on slide 26 has to do with decodable text. And for example, Flex Literacy focuses on age-appropriate decodable text. And so often if you've got a student who's older, who is at a lower reading level, the kinds of decodable text that he or she is given is pretty babyish. So you'd want to make sure that you've got decodable text that has the illustrations and pictures that are much more age appropriate, and also the text. And so here's one example of that. Not only would you work on sounds, but as students get to be better at reading, you'll want to give them a strategy on how to decode multisyllabic words that's shown on slide 27. And that would be taking large words and then learning a strategy on how to break it into component parts. And that's important when you're faced with science and social studies text. You can do decoding multisyllabic words in print, or on slide 28, you can see there's a computerized kind of an activity that's done in Flex Literacy, for example. Element number 2 has to do with fluency, and that's reading practices that focus on reading text quickly, accurately, and with expression. And that has to do with the foundational skill, again, in the Common Core of the sufficient accuracy and fluency to support comprehension. Because we know if students aren't reading quickly and accurately, they're going to be struggling and caught up on the decoding aspects, which makes it really hard to understand what they read. One example of this is from Read to Achieve, would be reading informational text where students read it out loud. They do cold timings where they read it right out of the chute. They do some practice activities, and then they do a hot timing. And those both cold and hot timings are graphed. The key here, though, is that they need feedback on how quickly, accurately, and with expression in some cases, that they read the text. Now, there's one aspect of fluency building that we need to make sure we don't forget, and that is anytime we do a fluency passage, we should always tie comprehension to it in some way. Otherwise, students are simply reading quickly and not thinking about what they read. So again, if you can tie a comp activity to it, that's considered to be best practice. Now on slide 32 is an example of the Hasbrook and Tyndall fluency norms. And if you choose a fluency program, it's important to take a look at the 50th, the 75th, and the 90th percentile. And of course, what you're shooting for is getting kids up to the minimum level, which would be the 50th percentile. And good programs will base their fluency norms off of this table usually, because it's a very well-respected source. This is what I talked about before with the cold timing, which is the blue line. That would be their first run at a passage. And then they practice typically 2 to 3 times, and then they'll do a hot timing. So you get a total of 4 reads on the passage. You'll see the black, the blue, and the red line. The black is the 50th percentile, the blue is the 75th, and then the red is the 90th percentile. And again, this student has hit the 50th percentile, which you could say is fine. Again, some people continue on with the student, but again, you're shooting for the 50th percentile for students. That'll help them navigate vocab and comp activities at a higher level. You can do fluency on the computer, and this is an example of fluency where it's recorded and listened to later by the teacher in Flex Literacy. Again, or you can listen to the student just sitting, side by side with the student. On slide 35, we're switching to element number 3, which has to do with reading words and phrases and understanding their meaning. And that is a Common Core standard, determining or clarifying the meaning of unknown words or phrases that are important to comprehension. Now on slide 36, we're looking at facts about vocabulary instruction, and we know most vocabulary is learned indirectly just by talking with kids and reading books and being read to. Vocabulary, though, that's not learned indirectly should be taught directly, and there's two ways of doing it. One is through specific word instruction, and then the second is through word learning strategies. 37 shows two ways of choosing words. One way can be where the teacher chooses words in a set of materials that he or she believes would be important for comprehension. Certainly another way is the program chooses the words. And still another way for kids to survey the text and choose as many as 8 words. The teacher writes them on the board. And then the students and the teacher, for example, can look up the meaning of those words. And then the student would read the text. So practice surveying. Here's on slide 38, just a passage. And I'm just going to have you look at it very quickly. And I have a feeling there's going to be one word that you believe would need to be taught. This is a 5th grade level passage. And then we can quickly talk about it after you have just a moment to survey that. And I'm guessing that the word that jumped out at you immediately was the word aroma. Okay, and again, words, vocabulary words will typically, pop up right away, and they'll need to be taught before the student would read the text. If not, then their comprehension would be hindered. Now on slide 39, there are 3 tiers of words. This is from the research by Isabel Beck and colleagues. Tier 1 has to do with basic words that we all know and use when we talk. Tier 2 are ramped up words that students will read about, hear on the news as an example. They're tougher words. And then tier 3 are typically science and social studies words. Now, best practice on definitions would be that on slide 40, we define the words with tier 1 or student-friendly words. So benevolent means good. Jovial means happy. A merchant is a person who buys and sells lots of things. And reluctant means not sure you really want to do something. So as you can see, I'm taking tier 2 words and I'm defining them with tier 1 words. And if you do that, you're really going to help ensure that students will understand what the words mean. Now here's a little, if you click on 41 and put all of it up there down through the word review previously learned words, this is my favorite sort of framework. It's from Doug Carnine and colleagues' direct instruction reading book. But it's a nice way of teaching what a word means. And so it kind of goes a little like this. Here's a new word, sturdy. And then you ask the students, what's the word? And the students say sturdy. And then you go through this kind of a little teaching frame with sturdy means strong. What does sturdy mean? Kids would say strong. What's another word for strong? The kids would say sturdy. So what we're doing is we're taking a tier 2 word and defining it with a tier 1 word. And then what you do is present positive and negative examples. And I've given 3 there. You'd ask the students, for example, Tom leaned against a pole, the pole fell over. Was the pole sturdy or not sturdy? And the kids would say not sturdy. And then they would talk about it. And you'd mix these up to ensure that students know what it is, but they also know what it isn't. And after you go through 6 of those as an example, or more if the students need more practice, then you can weave that in with previously learned words so they get additional practice. On slide 42, you can practice this on the computer where you have words in isolation. And then students can then practice the meaning, finding the meaning of words based on context. Now on slide 43, I put up a word here. You'll see it's the word logorrhea. It was a word that stumped me. My son brought it home when he had to memorize 100 of these words for the AP language exam. And so here's a tough word. I'd call that a tier 2 word. Logorrhea, and then you'll see that the meaning is too much talking. And that again is ramped down, so students will see that those are all tier 1 words. And then when you're working with flashcards, you show the student the word and the student comes up with the definition. But it's also important to show the definition and then the student comes up with the word. And that's just good vocabulary practice. You, on slide 44, can use a student vocabulary log where you have logoria, you have the student-friendly definition in Tier 1 words. Have them write a sentence and then they can draw a picture, and that's a helpful strategy for students. On slide 45, besides teaching them the meaning of words, you should teach them how to use a dictionary, whether it's a regular dictionary, print-based, or if it's on the computer. They should also do context clues and online sources. Slide 46 shows work with a thesaurus where they're learning synonyms and antonyms for adjectives. Now on slide 47, I just checked today on Amazon. That dictionary is my absolute favorite one, and it's only $11. So I would highly recommend it because it takes all of the typically Tier 2 words and defines them with Tier 1 words. So it's very, very helpful dictionary. Now we're moving on to slide 48, which is comprehension. We're on our 4th element. That's probably the biggest part of the Common Core, is everything focused on reading to pull out information. So that's citing text evidence and summarizing, determining central ideas, and analyzing text. So we're going to spend a bit of time with regard to that one as well. Slide 49 shows students should learn how to make a connection. So they need to think about what's going on in the text and what do I know about it. Next slide shows anything having to do with a graphic organizer should be utilized. And so programs that hang information on a graphic organizer are really helpful for kids because kids see it, they hear about it, and then they write in it. Slide 51 shows comprehension monitoring strategies with think alouds. And so I think it's important that students need to know that if they read something and they don't understand it, the very first strategy that they can do is to slow down and reread it and read around the difficult parts to see if they can make sense of it. So that's a good comprehension monitoring strategy. Slide 52 is question generation. Again, important to teach students how to ask questions related to the text, and those should be literal or inferential based. Mnemonic strategies are important. Here we've got the SQ3R procedure. I think if, anything having to do with taking a tough amount of information and then having some way of remembering it. So here we've got survey, question, read, reflect, review, but then students learn it as SQ3R. It just helps students to remember it at a higher level. Slide 54, and we're going to spend a little bit more time on that in a little bit. Teaching students a note-taking strategy is critical, and again, I'll spend more time on that in a minute. Slide 55 has to do with summarization, and to be honest with you, students really struggle with determining what are the big ideas of text, particularly when you ask them to provide a summary statement of text. And so in Read to Achieve, we teach this, but this is also considered the GIST strategy, and that would be on slide 55 where it says, who or what is the story about? So you would write down, for example, the main character would be there. What's the most important thing that happened to that who or what? And so you would write that aspect there, whether it's by the chapter or based on the whole book. And then you take the first column and the second column and you merge them into the main idea statement, and they have to fill in the blanks for 20 words or less for the summarization statement. When you do that, you really help students to determine the most important elements. If you want to do that by the paragraph, that's called paragraph shrinking. Again, I'm still on slide 55. But if you do paragraph shrinking, that's 10 words or less. You use the same strategy where you take who or what is it about, what's the most important thing that happened, and then write it in 10 words or less for paragraph shrinking. On slide 56 would be what you would use for informational text. The other was for narrative text. And so for informational text, the students would have an article that would be science or social studies focused. They would pull out the who, what, where, when, why, and how, write that information in the boxes. And then they would pull out that information to write a 30-word or less gist. And as they're filling in the gist, they would put a little check mark in each box as they put that information down below in the gist. And it's just a nice strategy in terms of seeing what to do. On slide 57, this is something that I've actually had to teach my own college students, so I'm going to spend a minute on this. When I give my college students questions that they have to answer based on an article, or if they have to answer questions based on the end of a chapter, sometimes the students don't answer the question that is asked. And so this strategy on slide 57 is a good one. What you do is you have the student write the question in the first column. Then what they have to do is they have to take part of their answer and or part of the question and put it in the answer. So let's say the question was, what are the 4 elements of effective instruction? Then the middle column would be the 4 elements of effective instruction are, and then list them. Because now we're making sure with that middle column that we're actually answering the question that was asked. And then the last one is a prove it. And that's where you would continue to answer the question using evidence that's in the text. And so there you could talk about each of the 4 elements in more detail. So again, you write the question, you take part of the question and put it in your answer, and then you continue on to prove it to show that you understand it. So again, that's a great way to ensure that students are answering the question and developing a higher level of comprehension. On slide 58, you can do this online, so students can learn how to pull out important details. They can learn what details are considered to be supportive for a main topic. They can learn what details aren't necessary for developing a main topic. They can also learn about how to make an inference based on the text. So again, these can be done on the computer. And then another area has to do with motivation. This is element 5. And that's one that, to be honest with you, when you look at the big 5 for K3, motivation is not listed. It is listed in grades 4 to 12. So this is one that we all have to do, I think, a better job on, is how do we get kids engaged and motivated to continue to read tougher text. One would be on slide 60 to include interesting topics. So this is Phineas Gage, who ended up having a tamping iron go up through his skull. And again, students want to read to know more about what happened to this guy. So interesting text. Anything on slide 61 related to digital learning is going to be very motivating for students. So reading text on the computer is motivating. Slide 62 has to do with cartoons and vignettes. For example, in Flex Literacy, we have the strategies actually are taught through vignettes and cartoons that have kind of a humorous flair, and that just helps build motivation on the part of students. Slide 63, a good one to use. I use it a lot in my college classes, and that's a think, pair, share. We use that in Read to Achieve. That's where you provide a question. The students think about it for a moment. You can give them like a minute or two. They pair up with a partner or in a small group. You could extend it to a small group, and then you share what they found, and that's very motivating. On slide 64, working with others for engaging text discussion. Anytime students can work together on a project, it's much more motivating for students. And now we're going to shift gears. I'm on slide 65. This slide, we can put up the 3 aspects, and then you should see Austin Powers. Let me talk about how to do a close read. What you're going to do is you're going to select a part of a text that's about 200 words or so in a passage. It can be less, of course, but you're going to read that passage 3 times, each with a different purpose. So the passage does need to be rich. The first time you read it, it should be like a retell of what's going on in the plot. You could ask the student to answer questions about the text. Then you read it again, now with a different purpose, and that's where you talk about what's the quality of the text, why did they choose this word, how do you feel when you read it, different literary devices. And then you have them read it again, and this is where you dig in deeper to say, what does this mean to me, what's the connections that I can make, and what is the author's point here. And that's why I put up Austin Powers, you know, that whoop-de-doo Basil, what does it all mean? Because students should always be thinking about layers, like layers of an onion. You're going deeper and deeper and deeper in terms of text. On slide 66, another strategy that works well with students is reading with a pencil. So when they're reading, they're taking notes, they're writing in the margins, they're marking down things that they don't know. Anything with a pencil certainly works well. Now I just wanted to share with you the results of one of my favorite analyses done by Don Losky and colleagues, and it has to do with best practices in study skills. So I'm going to share, this is slide 67, what are considered to be the very best ways to study in order to learn something at a high level. And number 1 is self-testing. So if you can get kids to take their notes and then transfer that to vocabulary cards, to answer questions at the end of a chapter, to quiz themselves in any way, to look at Cornell notes, which we'll take a look at again in a minute. If you're having kids study for the SAT, the ACT, or the GRE, the very best way to prepare is by taking multiple tests. And so again, self-testing, repeated testing, trying to get that information to go into long-term memory. Another aspect is that distributed practice, also seen on slide 67, and that's where you do a little bit every night rather than cramming the night before. So if you're studying for a large exam, doing a little bit of practice and self-testing each night before the exam is certainly better than waiting to the night before and then doing a power kind of study session. Okay, the next slide is slide 68, and that says what doesn't work, and these might be surprising to you. Number 1, highlighting. The evidence is not there to support it. The evidence is also not there if you're going to study by simply taking a text and rereading it. So if you've got your notes that you took in class and you reread them and you put them down, then you reread them, put them down. The problem with that is you're not doing anything novel with them. So if you are going to use highlighting and rereading, then you should take notes off of what you highlighted in a different way. You can rewrite your notes. You can transfer information from your notes over to vocabulary cards. It's actually doing that, but taking it to the next step that matters. Slide 69 shows the Cornell method, and I just want to spend just a few moments on this one as well. And that is on the left, that students should be taught a note-taking strategy because they don't know how to take notes out of a textbook. And so what you'll see on the left would be they take a heading in their textbook and they turn it into a question, and then they read to answer it. And then when they get to the next section, they turn that heading or subheading into a question, and then they read to answer it. If there's a vocab word, like on number 3, they'll turn that into a question, and then they put the answer and so forth. Now, what's nice about this is that you will fold this along that vertical line, and then you have an instant study guide that you can use where you can read the question and come up with the answer, or read the answer and then come up with the question. So we're now on slide 70 as kind of a quick recap. Does your program include the multiple elements of the big five? So as a quick review, we know that we need word study, and remember that's phonics instruction for those who don't have it. It's working on reading connected text, but more importantly, reading multisyllabic words and learning a strategy for that. Fluency is the second one, and that's reading text quickly, accurately, and with expression, with a focus on informational text and comprehension. We have vocabulary, where we're going to take tough words but define them in very easy ways. So taking tier 2 and 3 words and defining them with tier 1. Comprehension, we're going to be focusing on pulling information out of text, whether it involves summarization or main ideas or note-taking. And then finally, we're not going to forget about motivation, because we want our students to be as motivated as possible when it comes to literacy efforts. Now on slide 71, I just wanted to end with a program that does include these aspects, and that's Flex Literacy. It meets for the digital experience, which is computerized learning, again, and you saw examples of that program as we went through. But digital learning, again, is very highly motivated, and it meets Common Core standards in those areas. If you look at the print experience, students are getting a chance to work with small groups and answer questions about text, debate the text, and so forth. And you can see the Common Core standards that meet that one. And then the final one is actually doing research based on what you read, again with partners and presenting with partners. And you can see the Common Core state standards that are met with that one. And with that, I will open it up to questions. I know Mary is going to field the questions and read them to me, and then I'll do my best to answer them, and we'll just make sure we get your questions answered. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Nancy. The first question really had to do, going back to the beginning of your presentation, was a little bit more information on how to know whether a student requires tier 2 intervention or tier 3, particularly when they're older students in middle school and high school.
You know, if you've got students where you know, they're really struggling with phonics instruction, they're multiple grade levels below where they should be, then, you know, the point with that particular research article was that if you've got a 6th grader who's reading, you know, 1st and 2nd grade reading level, 3rd grade reading level, it would be best to jump into much more intensive efforts rather than trying to patch on a phonics program, you know, 20 to 30 minutes a day. That student needs much more intensive work, where we're looking at double the amount of time. So again, it depends on the presenting skills. If you're talking about decoding, I would move up into tier 3 right away. So, and again, you can look at that as, you know, our students reading below, for example, the 25th percentile would make an automatic decision to move up into more intensive efforts.
Okay, great. Second question just came in was, could you talk a little bit more about the project experience you were just mentioning?
Oh, sure. That one, there are project booklets that the students get. They'll get interesting things to research. They work with, you know, partner small groups, and then they might develop like a presentation that they can, a PowerPoint presentation that they can present in front of the group. There's one activity where they can build like a theme park, and they develop the name of the theme park and all the rides and so forth, and then they turn that into an actual brochure or presentation that they present in the rest of the class. And so those projects take reading to the next level, so that they're researching, but they're putting it together in a way that they've got to explain it and, you know, present it to others. So that's the third element, and that takes about 40 minutes every day to do if you add that element in. So you're looking at a full hour and a half of digital, print, and project-based instruction.
Okay. And another question had to do with, it looks like, phonics instruction. Is it just as successful doing that instruction digitally as with print? What do we know about?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'll tell you my bias. If a student is really low, I think you need a teacher. So my recommendation would be if you've got a student who's reading like pre-primer, primer, you know, first grade, I'd get a teacher in there. But as you start to move up into, you know, second and third grade level reading where students have, you know, some of those decoding skills under their belt, then again, my opinion here, but you know, I would move them into digital experiences. You know, if they are low, once you have the teacher working with them, you can put them on computerized aspects as you know, an additional piece that'll help firm up instruction. But if you've got a kid who's really low, in my opinion, you need a teacher. Teacher needs to hear them, you know, stop, back up, you know, listen, firm, and so forth.
Okay, and I think that was our last question. So thank you, Nancy, very much for the information. That was great, and I'm sure those that were listening today got a lot of information out of it. I know I did. So I want to thank everyone for attending the event today, whether you saw this session or attended any of the other 3 previous sessions. We appreciate you attending. The presentation will be on demand for the next 90 days. You're also going to be receiving a post survey, and answering that will actually help us to build our content for future events. So please take the opportunity to fill that out and give us some feedback on both the format and the content that you're hearing today. So thanks everyone for attending, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.